The concrete mixers were already idling at the edge of Arthur's gravel parking lot when the state engineers handed him the final notice. It was a Tuesday. To the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure syndicate paving the new 6-lane interstate, Arthur's 80-year-old hardware store wasn't a business, it was a rounding error. A crumbling brick eyesore sitting directly in the path of progress. They offered him pennies, mocked his stubbornness in the local papers, and openly laughed when he said he wouldn't move. They thought they could break him with a single bulldozer. But by midnight, the laugher died. A single, forgotten clause in a century-old property deed brought a $400 million federal highway project to a grinding, screeching halt overnight. They mocked his tiny store, but they forgot that a house built on ironclad law cannot be bulldozed. If you drive down Route 9, just past the rusted skeleton of the old foundry, you'll find Miller's Hardware. It doesn't look like a battlefield. The red brick facade is faded to a dull rose, the glass on the front display case is slightly clouded by decades of morning dew, and the sign above the door, painted by Arthur's father in 1948, is missing the letter R in hardware. To the executives at Apex Infrastructure Group, this place was an anachronism. A joke. The regional director, a man named Marcus Vance who wore $3,000 suits to muddy construction sites, famously referred to Arthur's shop as the splinter in the state's thumb. Vance's mission was simple: connect the capital to the coast with a flawless, 6-lane superhighway. It was a project backed by political promises, Wall Street funding, and the unstoppable momentum of eminent domain. Every other business along the corridor had folded instantly. The family diner down the road took the first buyout offered. The independent gas station packed up within a week. Even the local church relocated its congregation to a shiny new building 3 miles west. By the time the calendar turned to spring, Arthur's store was the only thing standing in a desert of cleared dirt and flattened asphalt. Arthur himself didn't look like a rebel. At 64, he was a quiet man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his palms and a habit of looking at a problem for 3 full minutes before speaking. He didn't hate progress. He just hated being bullied. When Apex first sent their junior attorneys with a lowball acquisition offer, Arthur didn't shout. He didn't throw them out. He simply poured them black coffee in paper cups, listened to their pitch about the greater economic good, and then pointed to the original oak counter beneath his cash register. "My grandfather laid those floorboards," Arthur told them, his voice as dry as sandpaper. "My father sold the nails that built half the barns in this county out of this very room. You aren't asking to buy a piece of dirt, son. You're asking me to let you erase 100 years of work because your blueprint didn't want to draw a curve." The junior attorneys laughed. They told him the state would just take it anyway. They used words like inevitable, compulsory, and obsolete. But Arthur had a secret weapon that the corporate lawyers, with all their databases and degrees, had completely overlooked. He had the dead book. The dead book was what the old-timers called the leather-bound ledger kept in the basement of the county recorder's office, records stretching back to before the territory even achieved statehood. While Apex's legal team relied on digitized title searches that only went back 40 years, Arthur spent his evenings under a single halogen bulb, turning pages so brittle they threatened to turn to dust in his fingers. As the construction crews drew closer, the pressure intensified. Heavy machinery was parked just 6 feet from Arthur's property line. The vibration from the diesel engines made the vintage glass jars filled with assorted brass screws rattle on his shelves like teeth. The crew foreman would walk into his shop, not to buy tools, but to smirk, point at their watches, and tell him his days were numbered. The local newspaper ran an editorial calling him a selfish relic, blocking thousands of commuter jobs. Contrast framing is a funny thing. To the public, it looked like a helpless old man stubbornly fighting an unstoppable titan. Apex felt so secure in their victory that they began pouring the concrete foundations for the massive overpass just half a mile down the road. They had already scheduled the governor for a ribbon-cutting ceremony 6 months away. They treated Arthur as an afterthought, an annoying delay that would be cleared up with a standard court order by midweek. Then came the night of October 12th. The state judge signed the emergency eviction notice, granting Apex the right to seize the perimeter of Arthur's lot at sunrise. Marcus Vance actually showed up to the construction trailer that evening to personally oversee the setup. He wanted to watch the fences go up around Miller's Hardware. He wanted to see Arthur walk out with his cardboard boxes, But Arthur wasn't packing. He was sitting at his kitchen table behind the store, looking at a photocopied map from 1892. When the sun broke over the horizon the next morning, the bulldozers roared to life. A crowd of reporters had gathered, expecting a dramatic standoff or a sad eviction. Marcus Vance stood by his flagship crane, a smug smile on his face, waiting for the sheriff's deputies to clear the building. Arthur stepped out onto the porch. He wasn't holding a shotgun or a protest sign. He was holding a single piece of paper and a blue plastic folding chair. He walked to the exact edge of his gravel driveway. Set the chair down directly in front of the lead bulldozer's treads, sat down, and crossed his legs. The foreman yelled at him through a megaphone to clear the area. Arthur didn't move. Instead, he raised his phone and made a single phone call to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and the Regional Railway Commissioner. Within exactly 42 minutes, a black sedan with federal plates tore down the unfinished dirt road, spraying gravel across the pristine paint of Apex's construction vehicles. A man in a dark windbreaker stepped out, walked past the stunned local police, and handed Marcus Vance a document stamped with a red federal seal. "Shut it down," the federal official said. "Shut all of it down right now." The heavy diesel engines did not just idle, they died. One by one, the massive yellow machines that had been chewing through the county's landscape fell silent, leaving nothing but the metallic clicking of cooling manifolds and the sound of wind whipping through the dust. Marcus Vance stood frozen on the asphalt, the federal injunction trembling in his hand. He looked from the paper to the man in the windbreaker, then down at Arthur, who was still calmly sitting in his blue folding chair, adjusting his spectacles. "This is a mistake," Vance stammered, his polished corporate composure cracking in real time before the rolling cameras of the local news. "This is a state-approved infrastructure corridor. We have eminent domain. We have a signed court order from a superior judge." The federal official didn't even look at Vance. He pointed back toward the massive overpass support columns that had been poured just days prior. "Your state judge doesn't have jurisdiction over a 19th-century sovereign land grant, Mr. Vance. You just poured 40 tons of industrial concrete directly over a federally protected right-of-way. Until an independent audit is completed, your entire project is a crime scene." What Arthur had discovered in the dusty basement of the county records office wasn't a minor zoning error. It was a legal ghost. Back in 1892, long before interstate highway systems or modern urban planning existed, the land beneath Miller's Hardware belonged to a small independent rail line called the Great Western Spur. To encourage westward expansion, the federal government had granted the railroad absolute, unalienable rights to a 100-foot wide corridor of land. The contract specified that if the railroad ever ceased operations, the land rights would not revert to the state. Instead, they would transfer entirely to the private estate of whoever owned the adjacent parcel, provided that the adjacent property maintained a continuous commercial business servicing the local community. For 80 years, 3 generations of Millers had sold nails, hammers, and kerosene from that exact spot. By keeping the doors open, even during the leanest years of the economic depression, Arthur and his father had unknowingly kept a century-old federal land covenant alive. But that was only half the trap. The real kicker, the detail that turned a minor headache into a catastrophic roadblock for Apex Infrastructure Group, was the spur clause. Because the original 1892 land grant was intended to protect interstate commerce, federal law dictated that no state or municipal project could obstruct, build over, or alter the grade of the designated land without a unanimous vote from a federal transport committee that hadn't actually met since 1954. By pouring their concrete overpass foundations within 80 feet of Arthur's back wall, Apex hadn't just encroached on a small hardware store. They had technically blocked a federally designated transport corridor. By noon, the atmosphere in the Apex corporate trailer had turned into a war room. The smug smirks were entirely gone, replaced by frantic sweating and the smell of stale coffee. Corporate attorneys from New York and Chicago were being patched in via emergency conference calls, their voices echoing through speakerphones in a chorus of disbelief. "How did our title search miss this?" Vance screamed, slamming his fist onto a folding table covered in blueprints. "We paid a compliance firm $2 million to clear this route." The voice on the other end of the line was flat, tired, and defeated. "They missed it because it wasn't in the digital land registry, Marcus. It was buried in the territorial archives under railroad land grants. The law is archaic, it's completely outdated, but it is technically still active. And because this project uses 15% federal matching funds, we are bound by their regulations. If we touch that store, the federal government pulls the entire $65 million funding block for the northern sector. Contrast framing shifted instantly. The selfish relic, blocking local jobs, was suddenly the mastermind who had outsmarted a multi-billion-dollar legal department. While the executives panicked, Arthur did something even more infuriating. He went back to work. He walked back into his store, flipped the sign on the door from closed to open, and began restocking a shipment of galvanized bucket hooks that had arrived the day before. Outside, the silence was deafening. The hundreds of construction workers who had been earning heavy overtime stood around in clusters, smoking cigarettes and looking at their phones. The concrete mixers had to dump their loads into giant waste pits before the slurry hardened inside the drums, wasting tens of thousands of dollars in material in a single afternoon. Every hour the machinery sat idle cost Apex an estimated $85,000 in contractual penalties. Vance knew he had to break the deadlock immediately. He couldn't wait for a federal committee to reform or a lengthy appeals process to wind its way through Washington. He needed Arthur's signature on a quitclaim deed, and he needed it before the stock market opened the following morning. At 3 p.m., the bell above the door of Miller's Hardware chimed. Marcus Vance stepped inside, his designer shoes stepping onto the worn oak floorboards that Arthur's grandfather had laid. The air inside smelled of oil, cedar wood, and old paper, a stark contrast to the sterile, air-conditioned corporate world Vance occupied. Arthur was behind the counter, using a hand crank to slice a length of heavy hemp rope for a local farmer who had slipped in through the back alley. He didn't look up when Vance approached. "Arthur," Vance said, his voice forced into a conciliatory, friendly tone that sounded entirely hollow. "Can we talk? Man to man?" Arthur finished slicing the rope, coiled it neatly, handed it to the farmer, and took $2.50 from the man's hand. Only when the register drawer clicked shut did he turn his eyes to the regional director. "I'm a businessman, Mr. Vance," Arthur said softly. "I'm always open to a fair conversation. But the price of iron just went up." Marcus Vance took a slow, deep breath, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored jacket. He looked around the small store, trying to conceal the raw desperation clawing at his throat. Every second he stood here, his career was bleeding out on the pavement outside. "Arthur, look," Vance said, spreading his hands wide in a gesture of engineered transparency. "We started off on the wrong foot. I get it. Big corporation comes to town, things get moving fast, and sometimes the little guy gets squeezed. I'm here to fix that. Name your number. We will buy this building, we will pay for a top-tier moving crew to relocate your inventory to a brand new, modern facility over by the retail park, and we will throw a substantial bonus on top for your trouble." Arthur wiped down the worn oak counter with an oil-stained rag. "A modern facility," he repeated thoughtfully. "Sheetrock walls. Fluorescent lights. Built next to a chain grocery store and a mattress warehouse. Tell me, Mr. Vance, does that modern facility come with 75 years of regular customers who know exactly which drawer holds the vintage solid brass cabinet latches? We can digitize your inventory, Arthur." Vance countered, his voice rising a fraction of an octave. "We can give you an automated tracking system. You won't have to look through drawers anymore." "I like looking through drawers," Arthur said mildly. "It gives me time to think." Vance's friendly facade instantly dissolved, revealing the cold, predatory calculation underneath. He leaned over the counter, dropping his voice to a harsh whisper. "Let's cut the folksy act. You found a loophole. Congratulations. You tripped us up for 24 hours. But don't mistake a temporary delay for a permanent victory. My legal team is already drafting an emergency appeal to the Department of Transportation. We are invoking public necessity. By tomorrow afternoon, a federal administrator will sign an override. If you force us to take that route, our current offer vanishes. You will walk away with absolutely nothing but a pile of legal bills you can't afford to pay. Sign the deed today, and you leave a wealthy man. Fight us, and we will bury you." Contrast framing is powerful because it highlights the true nature of a threat. To Vance, wealth was a weapon. To Arthur, wealth was irrelevant if it meant trading away his autonomy. Arthur looked down at Vance's polished gold watch, then met the director's eyes. My father always told me that when a man starts threatening to bury you, it usually means he's already standing in a hole he can't dig himself out of. I think I'll take my chances with the shovel, Mr. Vance. The delivery trucks carrying his weekly inventory were turned away at the edge of the sector by private security guards hired by Apex. Vance was playing a game of economic suffocation. He knew Arthur's cash flow was limited. A small-town hardware store relies on daily foot traffic, farmers buying supplies, and contractors grabbing last-minute tools. Cut off the oxygen, and the business dies on its own. Once the business ceased operations, the 1892 federal land grant condition, which required a continuous commercial business, would technically fail, and Apex could seize the land through standard state channels. Vance stood on the upper deck of the nearby concrete overpass, looking down through a pair of binoculars at the silent, hidden store. He smiled. It was a brutal, elegant checkmate. Or so he thought. Arthur walked out onto his front porch, looking at the massive plywood walls blocking his view of the world. He didn't look panicked. He walked over to his old telephone on the wall, picked up the receiver, and dialed a number he knew by heart. It belonged to the chief of the local volunteer fire department, who also happened to be Arthur's cousin, and whose grandfather had bought the nails for the town's original firehouse from Arthur's father. Hey, Thomas, Arthur said, adjusting his glasses. Are you still looking for a safe location to conduct that regional hazardous materials and structural integrity training seminar you were talking about last month? Within 3 hours, the quiet country road outside the construction zone erupted into a parade of flashing red lights and sirens. For massive, bright red fire engines backed down the narrow lane, their air brakes hissing in unison. They didn't park on the state's unfinished highway asphalt, they pulled right up to Arthur's gravel perimeter, blocking the very entrance Apex's private security guards had been defending. Behind them came 2 utility trucks from the county safety inspector's office and a white van belonging to the regional environmental board. Marcus Vance practically sprinted down from his elevated overpass perch, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. What is the meaning of this? He shouted over the rumble of the diesel engines, confronting the local fire chief. This is an active corporate construction site. You are obstructing a multi-million-dollar state corridor. Chief Thomas Miller stepped out of his truck, clipboard in hand, looking entirely unfazed by Vance's corporate authority. He pointed a heavy, gloved finger at the massive trench Apex had dug directly in front of Arthur's shop. We received an anonymous tip regarding an unpermitted, high-risk structural excavation adjacent to a historical landmark, Chief Miller said, his voice carrying easily across the dirt yard. According to County Municipal Code Section 44B, any trench dug within 15 feet of a commercial foundation that disrupts public access also disrupts emergency vehicle access. If Arthur's store catches fire right now, my men can't get a hose through your plywood walls. That makes your entire barricade an immediate, catastrophic public safety hazard. Vance scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. That's a local municipal ordinance. State infrastructure projects bypass local zoning codes. Our attorneys cleared this last week. They cleared the highway, a voice interrupted from behind the trucks. It was the county safety inspector, pulling a set of official yellow laminated notices from his leather bag. They didn't clear the municipal utility corridor. By digging this trench without an active county water inspector present, you've compromised the water pressure grid for the entire Southern Valley. I am issuing a stop work order on this specific utility sector effective immediately. Before Vance could even open his mouth to threaten another lawsuit, the environmental representative stepped forward, holding a digital scanning device. And because you've stalled the natural drainage of this gravel lot with your plywood walls, you've created an artificial retention basin. We've just detected runoff from your heavy machinery pooling near Arthur's well water line. That's a potential clean water violation. Federal clean water violations carry a fine of $50,000 per hour, starting from the moment the barrier was completed. Contrast framing is an incredible equalizer. Apex had spent months using the absolute weight of state law and corporate finance to crush a small-town icon. But they forgot that laws form an ecosystem. By pulling a single thread, the 1892 railroad grant, Arthur had loosened the fabric of the entire project, allowing the local community to shred the rest using the very bureaucracy Apex usually weaponized. By 5 p.m. that afternoon, the tables hadn't just turned, they had been entirely upended. Under the direct supervision of the county sheriff, Apex workers were forced to dismantle the heavy plywood walls they had spent all night building. The steel gates were unlocked, and the heavy trench digging equipment was ordered to be moved back at least 50 feet from Arthur's property line. Arthur's store was visible to the world once again. And the community responded with a vengeance. Word of the corporate blockade had spread like wildfire across social media and local radio stations. By the time the barriers came down, a line of pickup trucks, family sedans, and local contractor vans stretched nearly a mile down Route 9. People who hadn't bought a nail from Miller's Hardware in 10 years were standing in line in the gravel parking lot, waiting to buy whatever they could find just to support the store. Old farmers bought boxes of screws they didn't need. Local construction contractors shifted their entire commercial accounts away from the big box home improvement centers in the city, deliberately placing bulk orders for lumber, pipe, and concrete mix through Arthur. "I need 300 bags of premium Portland cement, Arthur," one local builder announced loudly at the counter, ensuring the corporate spies lingering near the door could hear every word. "And I don't care if it takes 3 weeks to deliver. I'm buying it here." Arthur's cash register didn't just click. It rang like a church bell, over and over again, processing more transaction volume in a single afternoon than the store usually saw in a fiscal quarter. The economic suffocation strategy had completely backfired. Arthur wasn't starving, he was thriving, backed by the financial muscle of an entire county that refused to watch their history get paved over. Meanwhile, Marcus Vance was sitting in his office trailer, his tie loosened, staring blankly at a spreadsheet. The financial reality of the situation was terrifying. The State Department of Transportation had just called him directly. The governor's office was panicked by the terrible public relations nightmare unfolding on the nightly news. The federal matching funds were still frozen, and the contract penalties for project delays had just crossed the $2 million mark. The board of directors at Apex Infrastructure Group gave Vance a definitive ultimatum: resolve the situation with Arthur Miller within 24 hours, or a new regional director would be brought in to replace him, and Vance's corporate career would be effectively finished. As the sun began to set over the dusty construction site, casting long shadows across the idle cranes, Vance realized he had no moves left. He had tried money, he had tried legal threats, and he had tried physical intimidation. Every single wave had broken against the quiet, unyielding rock of the old hardware store. He picked up his leather portfolio, left his hard hat on his desk, and walked out across the dirt lot toward Miller's Hardware for the final time. This time, he wasn't walking with the swagger of a corporate executioner. He was walking like a man stepping up to the gallows. The brass bell above the door gave a solitary, muted chime as Marcus Vance stepped inside. The chaotic rush of the afternoon crowd had finally cleared, leaving the store quiet once more. The air was thick with the comforting, unchanging scent of cedar shavings and machine oil. Arthur was right where he always was, standing behind the heavy oak counter, methodically running a brass key-cutting machine. The sharp whine of the spinning blade filing down metal was the only sound in the room. Vance didn't speak. He didn't bluster or threaten. He simply walked up to the counter, pulled a blank sheet of corporate stationery from his portfolio, laid it flat on the wood, and placed his gold pen on top of it. "The board is ready to offer you $5 million, Arthur," Vance said, his voice entirely flat, hollowed out by exhaustion. $5 million. You can retire tomorrow. You can buy a mansion on the coast. You can build 5 replicas of this store anywhere else in the country. Just write your name on the paper and give us the quitclaim deed to the railroad corridor." Arthur finished cutting the key, turned off the motor, and brushed the tiny glittering brass shavings into a small metal tray. He looked down at the blank paper, then looked up at the man who had tried to erase his life's work with a bulldozer. "You still think this is about a number, Mr. Vance," Arthur said softly, shaking his head. "That's your weakness. You look at a map and you see lines and dollars. I look at this floor and I see my father's sweat. You can't buy a century of roots with a corporate check. Then what do you want?" Vance pleaded, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned against the counter. "I don't have alternative routes. The concrete overpass columns are already poured. The highway alignment is set. If I don't get your signature, the federal government pulls the funding, the project defaults, and this entire 6-lane corridor stops dead at your property line forever. A multi-million-dollar highway to nowhere. Arthur reached under the counter and pulled out a large, rolled-up sheet of blueprint paper. He unrolled it across the counter, pinning the corners down with 2 heavy cast-iron weights. It wasn't a corporate document, it was a layout map drafted by a local civil engineer who happened to be a regular customer at the store. "I'm not a stubborn man, Mr. Vance. I don't want to stop the highway. I just want to protect my home," Arthur said, pointing a calloused finger at the drawing. "Look right here." Vance leaned over the blueprint, his eyes widening as he realized what he was looking at. Arthur's plan didn't require tearing down the concrete overpass or starting the project from scratch. Instead, it utilized a unique engineering compromise. The blueprint showed a slight, graceful curve in the 6-lane interstate, a split routing that divided the northbound and southbound lanes around Arthur's property. The highway would seamlessly expand, flanking Miller's Hardware on both sides like an island in the middle of a river of asphalt, before converging back into a single corridor half a mile down the road. "A split-lane bypass," Vance whispered, staring at the map. It keeps the grade intact. It bypasses the 1892 railroad right-of-way entirely without encroaching on your land. "And it leaves my store standing exactly where it belongs," Arthur added. "You get your highway. The state gets its commerce. And I get to keep selling nails to the people who built this county. But it's going to cost you." "How much?" Vance asked, bracing himself. "You're going to pay for the soundproofing walls to protect my shop from the traffic noise," Arthur said, his voice firming up. "You're going to pave a dedicated, accessible exit ramp that leads directly into my gravel parking lot from both directions of the interstate. And finally, you're going to officially designate Miller's Hardware as a protected historical municipal landmark on all your state travel maps." Vance stared at Arthur for a long, silent minute. He realized that this quiet hardware store owner hadn't just defended his property, he had completely rewritten the master infrastructure plan of the entire state through sheer preparation and community leverage. Vance picked up his pen. "I'll have the legal team draft the revision by midnight," Vance said. 6 months later, the governor's ribbon-cutting ceremony took place exactly as scheduled. The cameras rolled, the politicians smiled, and the crowd cheered as the first convoy of vehicles drove down the pristine, 6-lane superhighway. But if you look at the official state highway maps today, you'll see something completely unique at mile marker 14. The massive, modern interstate gracefully splits in two, curving elegantly around a tiny, defiant island of weathered red brick. They mocked his tiny hardware store. They thought a billion-dollar syndicate could bulldoze history without a fight. But today, thousands of cars drive past Miller's Hardware every single hour, a living testament to the fact that when a small-town business stands firmly on its rights, its community, and the ironclad law, even the grandest highway project in the world has to bend.